Welcome to View from the North on ThinkTech Hawaii. I'm your host, Jay Fidell. Today, we'll talk about the Canadian economic picture for 2025. What do the metrics look like? Our guest is Ken Rogers, retired Canadian businessman. Welcome to the show, Ken.
Hello, Jay.
Canada is our most important neighbor, so it's important that we know and understand the relative size of its area, its land area, resources, population, and economy compared to the US and other countries. And Ken can help us understand that. Ken, what are your thoughts about, the relative size of the Canadian economy vis-a-vis the American economy for 2025?
The American economy is gigantic compared to that of Canada. It's really about 12 times the size of the Canadian economy. Now, that is not to say the Canadian economy is small. The Canadian economy is perhaps best measured when you take the world point of view. For example, after World War II, there was the creation of what was called the G7. And those were the 7 nations that had the largest economies, and they together were the dominant force in the world. Now, that excluded China and Russia. Now, Russia at the time didn't have an economy that would have been as large as the smallest of the G7. Now, so you're really sitting where if you take, what's the today, if you were to rank the world's economies, Canada would be somewhere between the 7th and the 10th largest economy, because there are several economies that are now essentially the same size as Canada's. The relative size of the Canadian economy is important in a world perspective because Canada's economy is not quite as large as that of the United Kingdom or France, but it is slightly larger than Italy, much larger than Spain, and and so you're sitting where, on a world scale, Canada is a meaningful country, but relative to the United States, the US is about 20% of the world's total GDP. Canada is only about 1/12 of what the US is. So compared to the US, Canada looks pretty small. And parts of Canada differ very greatly from other parts of Canada, not unlike the United States. You have parts of the United States, like Mississippi, that compared to Massachusetts, which where Massachusetts is, I believe, the highest standard of living in the U.S. The difference between the Massachusetts and Mississippi is greater than the difference between the poorest and the wealthiest of the Canadian provinces. Alberta being the wealthiest and probably Newfoundland being the poorest. However, parts of Canada are essentially the same as parts of the United States. One of the more advanced parts of the United States is Washington State, like the Seattle area. Well, the Seattle area is really very, very similar to the Vancouver, which is just about 100 miles north of Seattle. There is a lot of trade between the two cities, a lot of travel between the cities, but the people seem very, very similar, as opposed to if you said people from Alabama or Mississippi generally have very little in common with most Canadians.
That said, Ken, what about the dynamic here? I know the stock market in the last few years has been terrific in the U.S. I'm not sure there's a good reason for that, but okay. And we keep hearing that the economy of Europe and the EU is on the decline. But how does the dynamic look for Canada as opposed to the US in 2025? I know that that calls for a prediction, but what is your thought?
The biggest uncertainty for the Canadian economy is Donald Trump. Uh, if you simply had a continuation of the policies that Biden had been uh, utilizing, Canada would be have a fairly promising 2025. However, Trump's threat for opening day is to start with a 25% tariff. Well, a tariff on the US has a very different meaning than a tariff on Canada. Like Canada's exports are about 35% of its GDP.
Wow.
You know, that's similar to the major countries in Western Europe, like France, Germany, and Britain. But the United States exports are only about 11% of its gross domestic product, where the US imports are about 14 or 15%. That is, the US runs a fairly significant trade deficit, but the size of the trade to the United States is pretty puny compared to any other major country in the world. You know, that's a very major economic advantage, especially when you think of some of the policies that Trump threatens to bring in.
What would happen with the tariffs? Um, can you describe, the domino effect?
Well, uh, Trump simply had a simple 25% tariff on absolutely everything. Well, let's take the biggest thing that Canada sells to the United States is oil and gas. We sell probably 4 million barrels a day of oil alone to the United States. You know, Canada's the fourth largest producer of oil in the world behind the United States, Saudi Arabia, and Russia. However, uh, the size of that in dollars is really pretty fantastic in terms of the effect to the Canadian economy. But what does it do to the US if you suddenly increase the price of the oil that Canada sends to the United States by 25%? You're going to have a jolting effect on a portion of the United States. That is, the oil from Canada doesn't go along the eastern seaboard to the refineries in places like Baltimore or Boston or Georgia. Instead, it all goes to the Midwest area, so that you'd have Minneapolis or St. Louis or that kind of area in the United States. Virtually all their oil for all their gasoline or any other use comes from Canada. So if you suddenly jack the price, you're going to have a jolt of inflation in that area of the United States. And inflation is much like there's no such thing as a little pregnancy. There's no such thing as a little inflation. It really, once you start it has a momentum and life of its own. It just keeps chugging.
Okay, that's on the American side, and that could be a very bad surprise, at least for parts of the US. But what about the Canadian size? If Trump puts 25% tariff on your biggest export, what effect does that have on Canada? Is that because they wouldn't have a market anymore? The market would be less? Would the market for Canada selling, for example, oil, be reduced?
If the United States imposes only the tariffs on Canada's oil, then someplace like Angola or Nigeria might be able to increase their production and sell oil to the United States so that the cars continue to run in the U.S. It's not as if the U.S. consumers just suddenly going to use about 1/3 less oil. That is, the oil that Canada produces is about half as much as what the US does. So that what it's imported into the US from Canada is somewhere between a quarter and a third of all the oil you use. It's a significant item but it really, in a world scale, eventually you could maybe get that oil from somebody else. You could buy it from Russia. If they're not going to impose tariffs on Russia, then the United States would be dumb enough to buy from their enemy rather than from Canada.
And that does suggest a process I think that's already in play. If Trump is going to put tariffs on, then countries are going to look for other markets. I think that's already happening in anticipation. For example, the EU is having meetings to try to deal with whatever his unhinged plans are. Of course, nobody, as you said, nobody knows for sure. But let's assume for a minute that that you can't sell as much oil to the U.S. And so in that case, you look for other markets. And we just heard that the pipeline that goes from Russia through Ukraine to Western Europe has been cut off because Zelensky really couldn't tolerate the fact that all that cash money was flowing into Russia to assist Putin in his war against them. So he refused to extend the agreement by which gas, I guess it is, comes from Russia into Western Europe because it comes through Ukraine. Will there be other adjustments? Those guys in Europe need energy. Would they buy Canadian oil and gas? Is the system by which Canada could transport Canadian oil and gas elsewhere robust enough, developed enough so that you could just switch your markets if the US somehow got in the way?
I'd rather answer that in a little broader way and go back and let's use history. In late 1929 or the start of 1930, the United States had a Trump style slap on a whole bunch of big tariffs. They had it was some kind of tariff act, anyhow. I don't remember the name of it, but essentially it was very, very instrumental in compounding the difficulties and creating the Great Depression. It really, the US immediately stuck some huge tariffs up. Everybody else retaliated with tariffs. World trade declined dramatically. And you had the mess by 1932. You had the bottom that was hard to ever get out of. I mean, it's really, really stupid to try to create a international trade war. So the first thing when Trump puts any tariffs on, every other country is going to retaliate about, what product might get some political savvy. For example, one of the last times Trump was playing with tariffs, Canada put a tariff on Kentucky bourbon because they thought that would be able to rattle some appropriate cage that they in the Senate would have a bit of an influence. And they picked other key items, what would really be annoying for the state of Ohio or the state of something else. And so they selectively picked some ugly tariffs more for the pressure effect on the US or on Trump's team politically. But if you do that worldwide, if everybody starts putting on tariffs to offset the other guy's rotten tariffs, you basically try to you diminish the amount of international trade. Because if I'm trying to create a business but if somebody is going to keep jerking around the prices, which tariffs in effect do, then I'm just not going to look for doing any business in that direction. Like I might see a wonderful market in the United Kingdom or in the United States for my product that I produce in British Columbia, Canada, but I'm not going to waste my time playing with it if you keep jerking around on the rules or on the prices. And so
Yeah.
your uncertainty is a key factor for all business decisions, and that Trump is just a landmine for creating endless uncertainty for everybody, both Americans and non-Americans.
Footnote to that is that would have to affect the stock market we have seen go through the roof in 2024. Would it?
Well, the stock market reaction currently, in my opinion, includes a belief that Trump's short-term policies will be good for those companies. Um, you when you think of the Canadian economy and you say, well, how about giving me the name of a few really large companies? Who makes the biggest splash in some field in Canada? And I say, well, there's General Motors, and there's Amazon, and there's Tesla, and there's you start naming them, and at least half of them are American. That is, the businesses in Canada, uh, in a lot of ways, some provinces in Canada are closer to the American average than some American states are. If I were to pick Mississippi and said, the province of Alberta is more American than is Mississippi. If you were to say, what does the average or typical American economy do? Um, so you create too much uncertainty with Trump's policies, which would be detrimental to every economy in the world, including the U.S.
Well, is the Canadian stock market linked? I know, as you said, half of the stocks are connected with the U.S., but is it if I watch the moves in the American stock market as against the moves in the Canadian stock market, are they joined at the hip?
They're pretty similar. They go up and down together. A ton of the larger Canadian companies are also listed on one of either the NASDAQ or the New York Stock Exchange.
This is not necessarily related, but we've had this big issue about tech visas, science and tech visas, and Musk and Ramaswamy, both billionaires in the tech space, have argued that the U.S. should not shut down tech visas because U.S. businesses need this high tech talent from elsewhere, India, China, who knows elsewhere, where they are better trained and better motivated than in American schools and colleges. Do you have the same problem? Do you contemplate shutting down technology visas? Would you be doing better than the US if that happens or worse?
While Canada's immigration system is a little different than the US, we've always had a sort of point system of the merits of each possible immigrant relative to what they can do for the Canadian economy. And so we've always favored anybody that could enhance the standard of living in Canada gets a higher choice than somebody that's going to be, a garbage collector, or some grunt job that, a housemaid or something. They don't even rate on our immigration scale.
Do people in Canada make the same claim that the base makes, is that we have to grow them at home, that we don't want to import anybody, that we should just, make our schools sufficiently better?
No, the case in Canada is a little even tougher than in the US. In Canada, the birth rate for women is now down to 1.2 kids per female during her lifetime, where you need 2.1 just to have the population stay even. Now, the US has a considerably higher, it's still less than two, but it's probably like 1 3/4 or 1 2/3. So Canada just to have the economy not go like Japan, where Japan has had a declining overall population because it had the really low birth rates, roughly the same as Canada's. But Canada has offset that with very aggressive immigration. Our immigration is for the last couple of years have been 500,000 people a year. Well, for the US, that would be like 5 million. You'd need at least 10 or 12 times as many to give it in proportion. So Canada really relies on immigration simply to keep its economy at least even. So, and Canada really has a strong wish to have lots and lots of immigration. Trump seems to be kind of against immigration, but the first effect that Trump will have if he tries to round up 11 million Americans, where are those 11 million going to go? What are they going to do? I don't believe they will all sit around and wait till he starts creating internment camps or whatever he's threatened. If he sets up one camp, there will probably be, 2 or 3 million Americans at the Canadian border the next day. It
Oh,
just,
yeah.
it,
Yeah.
so it's going to have a great effect on Canada. Just his stupidity on internal American policies are going to be really disruptive for Canada.
The one related area is the abortion issue. Because if you look at it from a demographic point of view, you talked about the hourglass phenomenon with population, um, the fertility rate. But our fertility rate ultimately has to change with unwanted children who are nevertheless born, who might have been aborted for the benefit of the parents and the community in many ways. But if they're not being aborted, if people are afraid to have abortions, presumably the rate of the birth rate will increase. However, those children will be largely unwanted and untrained and become a burden to society, to the social safety net. That's just a thought about how that works. Canada doesn't have that problem. What's the relative benefit or detriment of having one country where abortion is becoming more and more difficult and another where it is not? How does that affect, the fertility rate and the population with respect to Canada versus the United States?
I don't think it'll change the fertility rate in either place by much at all. I don't see it as a factor as much as Canadian medical profession will probably do considerably better with people coming across the border to get their abortions. Pretending they're just doing a little traveling, but having some other purpose. Well, there's lots of Canadians go to the US for medical treatment now. Some wealthy Canadians, if they have some simple operation like a hip replacement, um, the Canadian medical system will pay for that 100%. So more people will ask for their hip replacement sooner rather than later than would be the case in the US. They may just live without one. But the wealthy Canadian, he doesn't want to wait in line. Like he might have to wait for 45 days or 60 days to get his operation scheduled. Well, he can just pay and go to the Mayo Clinic or some fancy American hospital and get it, but he has to pay through the nose to get it, uh, like the average American, which is why they'll live without the hip replacement.
Going back for a minute, Ken, to this whole thing about planning. If we know there are changes in the wings, if we know that Trump is going to do some surprise, unhinged policies that will affect global economics and certainly economics with Canada, I understand that Canada, at the governmental level, has been having meetings among the ministers to try to figure out what steps, what options are available to soften the blow. Are you familiar with that? Can you identify some of the options they might consider?
The first thing was they uh, had the prime minister and the couple of key cabinet ministers went to Mar-a-Lago, met with Trump, and tried to explain to him the damage to the U.S. economy that his policies would cause. Rather than the damage that his policies would cause to Canada, because that just fall on deaf ears. Well, then the following thing is the strategy that Canada used last time uh, worked moderately well, but not fully well, because Trump put the tariffs on and he left them there for a lot longer than was justified or needed. And so they caused considerable pain or disruption in trade. But then, with the belief that after a little while, the tariffs will be gone. So, whatever the economics of trade were before he had the tariffs, they would arise after the tariffs are removed. And so that, everything continued as before. But this time round, that may not be the case. If he has the tariffs that are large enough and they stay on long enough, it may simply end people's willingness to wait him out or to play around and have their businesses disrupted.
How's that going to play with the continuation or non-continuation of Justin Trudeau's administration? If he is replaced, and it sounds like he will be, how would that affect Canadian policy, do you think, especially on economics with the U.S.?
Firstly, I think it's a pretty high certainty that he will be out, and probably and most likely his party, the Liberal Party, will be out. The right now, if you had an election in Canada tomorrow, the Conservative Party, which is going towards the Republican U.S., similar to them, conservative policies, but not as far to the right as the American Republican Party is now. They would be the government, and the policies in Canada wouldn't change very much at all.
And I also get the feeling that there'll be a resort, you know what I mean, a reorganization of priorities. You were talking about the G7 earlier in this discussion, with the U.S. and Japan and Germany and the U.K., France, Canada, Italy, and now we have emerging new major competitors, Russia and Brazil and India.
The BRIC
So I
group.
wonder, yeah, the BRIC group. And Russia may not be doing so well, especially after they lose a lot of money because of this termination of the gas pipeline. But query, what kind of reorganization on an international level would you foresee, given the vagaries of the war in Russia, the war in the Middle East, and Trump?
Trump, to Canadians, the belief is that he is somewhat of an isolationist, and that by putting tariffs on the products from your yesterday's friends, Western Europe was a friend of the U.S. and Canada was a friend of the U.S. and you know South America used to be friends of the U.S. Well, with Trump comes in and nobody's the U.S.'s friend, um, then they're going to try to deal with each other. That is, the first thing is the BRIC group will increase in its strength. Things like one of their prime targets is to try to replace the US dollar as a reserve currency. Now, if that were accomplished, that would be a major economic problem for the United States. I don't think Trump understands that, like he seems not to understand a whole bunch of economic things, thinking that, a tariff is paid for by the other country. That is, you put a tariff on the import of oil from Canada to the US, and he thinks somehow the Canadian is paying that, where he's not. It's the American. It's just a tax on the American that uses that product.
Taking everything we've talked about, including the disparity between imports and exports and economies of the various provinces in Canada, what does it look like for tax increases, either at the federal level or the provincial level going forward? I mean, for Canada, we're going to have a big tax reduction, which I am worried about actually, because he wants to make government smaller. He wants to defund the Internal Revenue Service. Doesn't sound like a really smart idea. But what about Canada? Do you foresee increases or decreases in federal and provincial taxes in 2025?
That's pretty hard to assess. One of the first things is Trump is really obsessed with the idea that if NATO is to continue to exist, everybody has to have at least 2% of their GDP for defense. Well, Canada has about 1.2%, I think it is. And, if you really think of what does Canada need defense for, it's really, do we defend against the Americans? They're the only one with whom we have a border. I suppose you could say we have the Arctic Ocean between us and Russia, but the northern part of Russia isn't worth much, and the northern part of Canada isn't worth much either. So it's, too many people, it's not too much worth fighting over. Although Trump's attitude for Greenland would tell you, well, gee, there's reasons, all of these rare earth minerals, a lot of them exist in those remote locations because nobody's done any mining there before to check them out. However, your economic disaster is really of Trump's making. He'll cause enough mess that it'll take a little bit of time, and it will hurt the stock market in the US. It will hurt the US economy. It will hurt everybody else in the world a little bit more than it probably will the US. That is the everybody else that he's going to impose the tariffs against, whoever now sells goods to the US. He seems to have a special bee in his bonnet about Canada because the trade deficit between Canada and the US is so large, but it's all because of the oil. If you just eliminated the oil, there would be no deficit with Canada. Generally, Canada sells to the US raw materials, and it buys from the US finished or manufactured goods or processed foods kind of thing. So, really in a trade exchange, the US gets the higher paying job. The Canadian who sells stuff to the US has a lower paying job. It helps explain the difference in standard living between Canada and the US is you could say we get cheated on trade from a Canadian point of view because we sell you the wheat and you sell us back the bread. It's almost that simple.
One other thing I wanted to ask you about, and that is vis-a-vis this movie I was mentioning. It's called The Good Trader, and it's a true story about the ambassador from Denmark to the US at the beginning of World War II. Denmark has a sort of territorial control of Greenland, and still today it does. And he cut a deal with the US, and this in his mind was very important to save Denmark and get the Nazis out of Denmark. He made a deal with the US to allow American air bases in Greenland. And that deal after the war got to be permanent. And I think the American air bases, I think they're still there. And so when Trump, talks about Greenland, He's talking about a long history of American involvement in Greenland, going back to World War II, and certainly offensive in any event to Denmark still. He's also, talking about Canada, the 51st state, and he's talking about somehow taking back the Panama Canal for reasons that are murky. So I wonder, A, your thoughts about any of these three options, B, how people in those countries are reacting to them, and C, whether if he presses on any of them, whether that will affect trade, economic relations between the US and these three places.
I don't think those comments are well received in any of the three places. In Canada, people can smile and say, well, the US isn't much different than us. So, you know, so he talks about that. We go back and forth across the border. We trade a lot. Anyhow, parts of Canada are closer to the average in the US than some states are. You know, for, for example, in the province I live in on the west coast, British Columbia, the residents of British Columbia, they travel back and forth to the U.S. Way more often than they travel to other parts of Canada. It's just that's a hand north south uh, uh, is more natural as a way in North America to get around than east west. Canada, like the U.S. is fairly compact. When you put 350 million people in the continental part of the U.S., try putting 1/10 of that many people in a country that's larger. Like the continental U.S. is only about 80% the size of Canada. When you throw in Alaska, then it gets closer. It's still smaller than Canada in square miles, but nevertheless, Canada's spread out, and so it's an awful lot further from Vancouver to St. John's, Newfoundland, than it is from Los Angeles to New York. It's about 1.5 times as far, and yet the population is so sparse in most places. Like about nearly 60% of Canada's population is within 150 miles of Buffalo.
So it strikes me, though, that when you have rhetoric that threatens the territorial integrity, the sovereignty of these three places, you are not improving diplomatic relations, much less trade. Am I right about that? You said that people in all three places would not favor that. But I wonder if it affects governmental relations, diplomatic connections, relations, because I suspect, just looking back on history, that it would have a bad effect for a long time when you start threatening sovereignty. No?
Common sense agrees with that
Yeah.
fully, and part of Trump's strategy is divide and conquer. You will have some Canadians say, gee, well, that might not be so bad. That, now certainly in the province of Quebec, I don't think they'd like that at all, because they would simply say, look at what happened to Louisiana. They used to speak French there, and they had a French culture, and now it's a joke. There's no, they call it the French Quarter, but it's really not French at all, compared to Montreal or Quebec City. That type of talk would have the odd person in Canada say, gee, I think, the province of Alberta might be better off if it's just a state in the US. You've got some provinces in Canada that think they get cheated on a federal level. And the one that's most obvious is Alberta. Alberta is the one which has the oil, and it pays more tax to the federal government than the province of Ontario does, where Ontario has about 3 or 4 times the population. Just per capita, it's a very unfair system, and therefore, they will grumble. Just because Alberta's richer or has way more income than everybody else, why should they, pay that disproportionate share to the federal government?
What about you, Ken? I mean, how do you feel about this? I assume you're opposed to it, but how opposed are you? From a rational economic point of view, from even an academic point of view, could this be done ever? And would it be successful in any way? Or would it create problems that go far beyond our expectations?
I don't think you could ever get it through the Canadian population. There are some things about Canada that Canadians value so highly that they would say absolutely no way. For example, the attitude for guns in Canada. Canada is so anti guns. They think that Americans are absolutely insane to have gun laws, and we have increases, every year with more efforts to restrict the export of guns from the U.S. into Canada. Trying to sneak them across the border. You similarly have in the United States or in Canada, you got socialized medicine. That is, no person ever goes bankrupt in Canada because of a medical problem. Where, in the United States, all kinds of people have, major medical problems. They never ever get fixed because they can't afford to pay for it. And that hurts the economy. People working with disability that would otherwise be fixed. The Canadians will not give up their socialized medicine. You said, let's have a vote for, you know, statehood versus, and they'd say, well, are there any conditions? I mean, can't we keep some of the things we have that are far better than Americans? The American attitude is always whatever the US has must be perfect. Where Canadians think it's terrible. Your gun policy, your all kinds of your policies are somewhere between insane and stupid. The electoral college, it's pretty pathetic method of warping the vote.
Well, okay, we're almost out of time, but I wanted to ask you, what should we be looking for? Where should we be learning from to see how things will go relatively between the U.S. and Canada in 2025? What metrics should we be studying?
Pray for Trump to get some sanity, or pray for advisors which will be sensible, that he will listen to, because otherwise it's just a loose cannon, floating around, and you don't know which way it's going to shoot. You just don't know what's going to happen, and I think that's the uncertainty of 2025 is, and it does not look rosy. Having spent years in the U.S. and had got my master's and doctorate degree in the U.S., I'm a great fan of the United States, but certainly not of this leadership. I feel sorry for Americans, but also the rest of the world.
Well, thank you, Ken. Ken Rogers, retired Canadian businessman, for a discussion of what it looks like economically between our two countries in 2025. I'm your host, Jay Fidell. Thanks, Ken, and thanks to our viewers for watching. Aloha.
Bye from Canada.